You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find it very concerning that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle consistently criticize public schools and then highlight what they see as their shortcomings, many of which are the product of decades of disinvestment, while proposing policies that would drain more resources from public schools and decrease their capacity to effectively serve, and I want to emphasize, all students, because as we know, the voucher schools and charter schools, they don't all take all students. And when you adjust for all of those factors, I think it's baffling to say that funding doesn't matter. It does. But I'm going to ask my question to Professor Black. I appreciate your expertise on civil rights, and particularly your scholarship highlighting the benefits of equal access to public education. You know, for decades, civil rights laws, Title IX, IDEA, ESEA, those have significantly decreased discrimination and contributed to the goal of providing all students with the opportunity to get a high-quality education. So how can absolving schools, especially private religious schools, from following civil rights laws affect students and families who may choose a private school as part of a choice program? And Professor, if you could bring the microphone a little closer, I think we'll have easier time hearing you.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think, as one of my colleagues once said, the further our children get away from public schools, the less we can protect them.
Can you raise that up just a little bit? Thank you.
I said the further children get away from public schools, the less we have the capacity to protect them. And, you know, you mentioned in your opening remarks that ultimately Milton Friedman's initial arguments were laid dormant regarding private school choice, and it really was not until the state of Virginia decided that it wanted to resist the desegregation of public schools there that there was any takers in the public school sector. African American children, at least at that time, chose to stay home rather than to participate in a private segregated system. Now, of course, a lot has changed since then, but as you point out, states consistently refuse to apply anti-discrimination standards in their private school programs. In fact, you know, when we have hearings like this and people insist there must be accountability, there must be anti-discrimination protections, religion, gender, sex, there is almost always a refusal to include those provisions in those programs, and so students are left to a market that can deal with them instead of students dealing with the market.
Right, and I want to get to a couple more questions, Professor Black. And I want to know, I'm going to ask about students with disabilities, but I just want to know, like, I think about our role as policymakers. I think about all the students who were in the school. Ms. Allen, awesome that you're doing well. I think about all the students who are in the school you left. Our obligation is to them as well. Professor Black, I want to ask you about students with disabilities. I know they're participating in school choice programs. So where are they going, and what do the schools do to meet their needs? You know, traditional public schools have infrastructure. They have specialized personnel, they have teachers, they have speech and occupational therapists, they have adaptive equipment. So what happens when students with disabilities go to some of these schools, and how would unenrollment of some students with disabilities and the money provided diminish the services to students with disabilities who remain in traditional public schools?
Well, so two things. Number one, the IDEA protections which you referenced do not follow the students there. And in fact, some states have required students, although it's not always transparent, to sort of waive any disability rights they may have as a condition of accepting enrollment in a private voucher program. So that's number one. Number two, when you have fewer special education students enrolling in the private system, what you really have is a concentration of them in the public system, which again has an increased cost in the public system. It's losing students who may be easier to educate or cheaper to educate, but retaining the higher cost students. Public schools don't object to that, but there is a financial consequence to it.
And they may go back to public school and then not get the funding, as Mr. Pocan pointed out. My third question, Professor Black, some people, including some here today, have posited that a massive multi-billion, up to $10 billion school choice federal tax credit would not affect public school funding, which I find a bit baffling because it seems like $10 billion less in revenue that could be used, for example, for fully funding IDEA. So do you agree, and why or why not?
Well, as you point out, the federal government has yet to fully fund the IDEA in the history of the program, so any dollar spent elsewhere would be a dollar not spent there. And I think to take that same point, as I always emphasize at the state level, until you have discharged your constitutional responsibility of the public education program, I don't believe it's appropriate to consider alternatives to that program because there's an absolute obligation there.
And just to clarify, a $10 billion school choice federal tax credit would reduce federal revenue by $10 billion. Isn't that correct?
That's true. And if we look at the state level, any type of tax credits, movement of dollars from one system to the other does have the effect either directly coming out of the public education funding program or indirectly coming out of it.
Absolutely. And Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired, but as I yield back, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the National Coalition for Public Education encouraging Congress to reject private school vouchers.
Without objection. There's been a